Hey, I'm Dr. Hannah, and today we're going to talk about type 1 diabetes and polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS. I was really shocked when I started reviewing for this video because there's a lot of big data on type 1 diabetes specifically with this type of hormonal challenge. And sometimes we don't see big data, especially in a smaller subset of the population like type 1 diabetes. So we're going to talk about how PCOS is related to type 1 diabetes, how often we're seeing it in women with type 1 diabetes, and what we know about effective treatment strategies, both medication-based and lifestyle-based. And really look at this from a root cause approach, understanding the why behind why it's happening, as opposed to just looking at what we can do to kind of band-aid the hormonal changes. And you've probably learned from either growing up with type 1 diabetes or learning to manage it in adulthood that understanding the why behind our hormonal shifts with insulin is really helpful at figuring out how to manage it. And so it's the same way with female hormones, in my opinion. And so what I love to do is start with introducing some studies that I found, again, because we have big data, which is exciting. So I found 3 different systematic reviews, which means there were researchers and statisticians that got together and looked at multiple different smaller studies and collected the data, analyzed them, and then came up with statistics. And we don't have very clear, precise data on the percentage of people with PCOS and type 1 diabetes because there are a couple different criteria used to define it out there. But what we see by and large from the 3 different systematic reviews that I will link to below is that women with type 1 diabetes absolutely have a higher prevalence of PCOS and other what we call hyperandrogenic traits. And hyperandrogenic traits essentially are traits associated with higher levels of testosterone. So that may be things associated with what we call hirsutism, which is where we get thicker hairs growing on our face. General menstrual dysfunction, which might mean an abnormal menstrual cycle, an uncomfortable menstrual cycle, a more heavy menstrual cycle, an unpredictable menstrual cycle, and then hyperandrogenemia, which is when we have higher testosterone levels showing up in the blood. So these are things in addition to what we call polycystic ovarian morphology, which is where we're starting to see changes in the ovaries themselves, which is a little bit different than PCOS itself. We can combine all these things under the same umbrella, which is just showing that there's a kind of an imbalance of female hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone that's leading to symptoms around menstruation or around the way that our ovaries are shaped, the anatomy of them, so those cysts popping up. So that is unfortunate news. If we know that in general we have a much higher prevalence, we can say that the prevalence rates of polycystic ovarian syndrome and type 1 diabetes range from 16 to 40%, depending on the diagnostic criteria we were using in the studies. And what's helpful about this is that if you have PCOS and type 1 diabetes, you are absolutely not alone. That's a really large percentage. 16 to 40% is huge. My thoughts here are, of course, the why. Now, PCOS is something we see, obviously, in many women without type 1 diabetes. I don't think that we can look to type 1 diabetes as our root cause at all. But understanding that the metabolic challenges that we have that come with type 1 diabetes could be contributing to the onset of it is worth exploring. And so as we look at PCOS and we really understand the why behind this happening, it's pretty clear in the literature that we now have an understanding that the polycystic ovarian syndrome symptoms and the changes in the ovaries, right? So these cysts that are popping up are often correlated with higher testosterone and an imbalance in female hormones that are often also correlated with insulin resistance. A lot of people have misconceptions around insulin resistance in type 1 diabetes because we're very often taught that type 1 diabetes is an insulin deficiency. We don't have any, we need to replace it. And type 2 diabetes is where our body can't use the insulin that we do make. And sometimes we even make more than we need, but our body has trouble using it. Our cells can't quite use it as effectively. And that's very true. However, there can be a lot of overlap. Just like someone with type 1 diabetes can get a lot of other medical conditions, we can also get insulin resistance from this insulin that we're taking. And so that is often very rooted in lifestyle or understanding what habits and patterns in setting up our life work for our individual bodies, which is not always intuitive, in my opinion, in today's environment. And so what we see in general is that women who have PCOS or these menstrual irregularities often use more insulin than women with type 1 diabetes who don't. And so that's the correlation that we're able to pull out of the data that kind of gives us a perspective that insulin resistance is probably a part of the picture for people with type 1 diabetes and PCOS as well. I think anytime we talk about other conditions that are increased risk or increased prevalence with type 1 diabetes, I always want to take a step back and think about the mindset, because I know when I was younger in my 20s, learning about different things that were correlated or had increased risk with type 1 diabetes, I just kept thinking like, oh man, like another thing. This is really unfortunate. And it kind of made me think like I got the short end of the stick in life. Like, oh, I have this type 1 thing and now I have all of these other increased prevalence, and it's just not fair. And it was just like another kind of heavy thing to carry on my shoulders of how unfair it was for me. And I don't see it that way anymore. And I think that mental shift for me was hugely impactful for my quality of life. And I want to talk about that piece first, and then talk about the action steps and what we know about treatment, because that piece is really important. Now, I believe fully that when we have type 1 diabetes, we are still in full control of our health, or we have the responsibility to take care of our health, just like someone who wouldn't have type 1 diabetes. But there's a lot that we have control over based on how we set up our life, how we set up our habits and patterns, our choices, our thought processes, what limiting beliefs we choose to let go of, what new thought patterns we choose to bring on, the actions we take. We've got a lot within our bandwidth of choices. And a lot of these increased prevalences don't take away our choices. Now, some of them do. I think arguably celiac disease seems to come on similar to type 1 diabetes, where it's something that's pretty lifelong and challenging to reverse. But I would say that PCOS falls in a category where a lot of lifestyle interventions can make a huge positive difference. And we could say too that type 1 diabetes falls into that category. If we're more intentional with our insulin timing and we're able to keep our time and range a little bit higher, that our decisions, our habits can impact our outcomes with this disease. And this is just another thing that points in that direction. So I don't see this as another kind of woe is me, I'm at an increased risk for hormonal imbalances because I have type 1 diabetes. I see this as this is another clue that the steps that I take to take care of myself are really important. And if we choose to look at it that way, it can be more empowering. I think especially with female hormone symptoms, I've had in my past lots of different abnormal periods, painful periods. I've done a lot of things to work on hormone balance from a natural approach, not using synthetic hormones, and have gotten a long way where I feel like my periods are now predictable, more comfortable. I'm able to understand how I need to change my insulin dosing around it, and I feel good in my body from the female hormone sense. And I think that we have a lot of choices. And so I want this to be an empowering video as we talk about these things. My puppy is barking at herself in the mirror, so in case you're hearing any growling. Okay, so with that, let's talk about the actionable steps, because that's probably why you clicked on this video. I think anytime we learn about things that we can change, we want to know how to. And so once we've got that mindset piece right, then we can look at the actionable piece, and that would be my recommended approach. So when we look at lifestyle interventions, they're a cornerstone for managing polycystic ovarian syndrome in women with type 1 diabetes. The 2023 International Evidence-Based Guidelines for the Assessment and Management of PCOS, published by the National Health and Medical Research Council, also the European Society for Endocrinology, American Society for Reproductive Medicine. We've got a big group of societies. They're all recommend lifestyle interventions for women with PCOS to improve metabolic health including central adiposity and lipid profile. So all of these big medical organizations around the world, and I'll list this in the show notes, but they are all pointing. This is so funny. I don't know if you can see her, but I'm going to try and show you because it's adorable. Okay. All of these big organizations are showing that lifestyle interventions make a massive difference. And when we focus on central adiposity, which is how much extra fat tissue we're carrying specifically around our abdomen, and our lipid profile, so that's essentially our cholesterol levels, we can make a positive movement in the direction of this condition. And so when we're looking at, well, what type of lifestyle interventions give us the biggest bang for our buck as it relates to PCOS and type 1 diabetes, it's pretty clear the three that stand out in the studies are nutrition, exercise, and behavioral strategies. Behavioral strategies look a lot like our thoughts and our choices. Now, anything we can do to optimize our general health is going to improve this condition. So if we're improving our quality of life, our overall weight, if we have a BMI that's higher, if we need some weight management, that can help improve things. And when we look at what types of interventions that are related to diet, exercise, and behavioral strategies, what we see is that if we can improve glycemic outcomes, meaning that if we can improve our blood sugar, that can make a positive difference in the androgenic symptoms. So the symptoms that are coming from PCOS or those other hormonal imbalances that we talked about in the beginning of the video. And that if we can improve our anthropometric measures, which kind of means our BMI, that central adiposity, that extra fat tissue that we carry around our abdomen, that can make a really big difference. Now, we have other systematic reviews that show lifestyle modifications can make a difference significantly when we do reduce our fasting blood glucose, and here's the key, insulin levels in women with PCOS. The way that we talk about reducing insulin levels in women is so important, because what this means is not that these people took less insulin as a starting step. It means that they figured out what lifestyle shifts, maybe what other nutrition patterns, what other exercise they could add in. If they were sleeping more and their stress got lower and they needed less insulin to maintain their blood sugar in a range that we want it to be most of the time, and that required less insulin to get to that maintained blood sugar, that's where we see benefit. Now, if we reduce our insulin and we don't make those changes in how much insulin our body needs, and our blood sugar runs higher because of it, we're going in the wrong direction. We're putting more stress on our body. We're creating a higher fasting blood glucose. We're going to move our hormones in the wrong direction. So that is not a solid choice, even if it does help us lose weight, which we see. So number one is adjust the things like nutrition, lifestyle, exercise, behavioral strategies until we're finding that we need less insulin, and that can make a positive difference. And by less insulin, we absolutely know that less is not better. So it's not on a graph of if we can take as little as possible, we're going to be the most healthy. That's not how it works. What we actually know is it's kind of a bell curve. And for you in your body, at your most healthy self, what we see is that there is probably an amount of insulin that will work for you in this chapter to keep your blood sugar controlled and keep you moving in the direction of your other goals. What we know is that lifestyle interventions, including diet, exercise, and behavioral management, can make a big difference for people with PCOS and type 1 diabetes. And when we look at these things, if we can move in a way that requires our body to need less insulin and manage our blood glucose, so not just take less insulin and run high, but need less insulin in order to keep our blood sugars in a healthy range where we want them to be, that can improve female hormones and thus PCOS and other menstrual irregularity symptoms. Now, we also see that with nutrition, and we see that with behavioral strategies. So that might mean meditating so we're a little bit less stressed, or that might mean sleeping more so that we're a little bit less stressed and tired. A lot of people don't know this, but our chronic stress hormone, so the hormone that we produce more of when we're stressed, kind of in that fight or flight nervous system, often is called cortisol. And that hormone, we actually use a lot of building blocks from our kind of hormonal building block stores in order to produce cortisol. So it's a great thing that our body helps us by producing cortisol as a response to stress, but it does pull from those building blocks that create female hormones, and it can create an imbalance in female hormones. This process is called pregnenolone steal. You can look more into it if you'd like to know more about the biochemistry behind it, but the point is understanding that stress and sleep impact cortisol in our bodies in a massive way, and that is very correlated with our female hormone imbalances if we're having them. Now, I want to provide an example for you from my life because I understood this concept in biochemistry as I was going through school, but it wasn't until the end of my medical training that I really saw how much of an impact it can play in our day-to-day lives. And so in medical school, we have these big 8-hour exams. There are board exams, and they're pretty stressful, or at least my friend group in medical school, we put a lot of stress on ourselves around them. And you study, for like 2 years for these things. And as you get closer and closer to the test, you start studying more, your stress goes up. My stress went up. I was maybe not exercising quite as much, not sleeping quite as much, certainly not relaxing. I think that was probably the biggest change that I made, was I was just constantly studying on all my free time. I wasn't taking time to decompress and journal or meditate or do yoga or the other things that I like to do for stress management. And so because of that, as we were getting closer to this test, my period stopped. It didn't come. And that happened for a little while, a couple months. And I was talking to my girlfriends at a study group. We were all about to take this test. And I wasn't the only one that this happened to. And I was just completely shocked that the amount of stress that we were in, first of all, wasn't healthy. And I think that we were somewhat doing it to ourselves. But it really did very clearly change our female hormones. And I don't want to say all of us, most of us that I talk, I can't say I followed up with everybody, but most of us are, after that test, our periods just came back to normal and expected and predictable timeframes. So that's a testament to stress makes a difference. And I think we often like to sweep that one under the rug because we don't know what to do about it, or we feel like it's out of our control. But I want to speak to that as part of this, because we can talk about diet, nutrition all day, and exercise all day. And if you have those things perfect, and you're very stressed out because of them, we're not moving ourselves in the right direction. And there were other times in my 20s where I certainly learned that the hard way. And so what I'd like to say about PCOS is that as we're looking at what we can do to optimize things, we have to consider our whole life, not just our health habits, but our quality of life, because that is a true predictor of how balanced our hormones can be. And that sounds so soft science, but we see it show up in the literature. We understand the biochemistry behind it. So it really is important. And I want you to know that, because I don't think that we always get that understanding at this depth in a shorter doctor's appointment. And it's harder to understand when we look at just PCOS or we look at just type 1 diabetes, because these things overlap. They're so correlated. We have, pieces of connection, but when we look at both, it's a lot more complex. So in the big systematic reviews that we've looked at, we're seeing pretty solid evidence that lifestyle modifications significantly reduces fasting blood glucose levels and insulin levels in women with PCOS. So in women who are moving in a positive direction at treating their PCOS and improving their symptoms, we are seeing that their blood sugars are becoming more balanced and their insulin levels are decreasing. Now, this study is done in people without type 1 diabetes. So I'm using this as a clue for our root cause as we look at ourselves with type 1 diabetes. Now, if we know that more balance, so essentially for this population, less high blood glucose levels and lower insulin needs are helpful for these symptoms, we can then look at our life with type 1 diabetes and say, okay, if I can increase my time in range and I can figure out how to do that in a way where I'm requiring less daily insulin, that will likely move me in the direction of the improvement seen in this study, if I hit the middle of the bell curve. And so when I talk about reducing insulin levels in women with type 1, it's so important that I'm clear that this means reducing the amount of insulin that you need to maintain balanced blood sugar. It doesn't mean that just cutting your insulin back and increasing your blood glucose levels and letting them run high so that you can have less insulin is going to move you in the right direction. This study, shows us it absolutely will move you in the wrong direction. If we have higher fasting blood glucose levels, that's going to put a lot more stress on our body. That's not going to help us with our hormone balance. And that's honestly probably not going to make us feel good at all, which goes back to that quality of life piece. And so what we want to really look at as what are the maybe exercise or movement changes that we could add onto our life that would then require us to need a little bit less insulin as part of our total daily dose and increase the amount of time in range that our blood sugar is. What are nutrition changes that we could make? Now, as a person with type 1 diabetes, we often think, okay, well, I know that I need carbs in order to, I need insulin when I eat a lot of carbs. So if I want to reduce my insulin, I should go low carb. And that's a controversial topic. I think for some women, I see that approach work. For a lot of women, I actually see a very low carbohydrate diet negatively impacting hormonal balance because we need carbohydrates to signal to our body that we have enough food coming in. Carbohydrates help us with our estrogen kind of creation and metabolism. And so sometimes when women go very low carb, they actually lose their period because they don't get that regular signaling. So I think that if we take this data and we swing too far in the low carb direction, there's a risk associated with that. Now, it doesn't mean it's not the right thing for you. Clearly, that's something to talk about with your doctor, but it's something I want to speak to because a lot of times when we look at these low carb and ketogenic diets, we're not looking at the female hormone component fully. And clinically, I've seen that show up in a lot of different ways for women, meaning that for some people, it's a slam dunk. For other people, it really wreaks havoc on their hormones. And that probably has a lot to do with genetics, a lot to do with where we're starting metabolically. There are a lot of components involved with that. But I would say that if you can find a way to eat that is less processed food, less inflammatory food, you can decrease your insulin needs quite significantly without having to decrease your carbohydrates hugely. And I don't know that we all know that as a society of people with type 1 diabetes is that when we're eating more processed food, it changes the way that our body absorbs nutrients. It can change the amount of insulin that we need. And when our bodies are in an inflamed state, we also need more insulin. And so needing more insulin is not bad in this case at all, but it's helpful to look at, if you eat a meal that is, let's say, a bowl of quinoa and kale, and you've got some vegetables and some protein on there, and you eat that meal, it might not need as much insulin, let's say, as the same amount of carbs in pizza. A lot of you who have figured out how to eat pizza and make your blood sugars work, it often looks like taking insulin for the pizza in the beginning or a portion of it, and then taking some more insulin later to cover all that fat that you're continuing to absorb, with the carbohydrates mixed in. And so what we see is that you might need a lot more insulin to cover the carbs in the pizza versus the carbs in that quinoa veggie bowl, even if they're the same carbs. And so that's what I would recommend looking at to start with, is looking at a whole food diet as opposed to eating processed foods instead of going low carb, because that's where I see movement in the right direction for most people. Now, again, this is something anytime we change our insulin, anytime we change our nutrition plan or the things that we're going to do that are going to affect our insulin needs, we want to run it by our local physician that we're seeing for our care, because they may know a part of your story that I don't know, and they may be able to provide you information in a right direction for you with the details. And unfortunately, the details matter in this situation. So know that reducing central adiposity, which means reducing kind of the extra fat that we have around our abdomen, decreasing our fasting blood glucose levels, and decreasing the overall total daily dose of insulin that we need can help women with type 1 diabetes and PCOS move in the right direction of creating more balanced hormones. And again, do not forget the stress piece. Do not forget the sleep piece, because that is huge and so important. I know personally that when I am not sleeping, and I got really clear on this when I was doing night shifts in the hospital, when I am not sleeping, my basal rate needs can almost go up by 50%. So like if I need, let's say, 20 units of basal insulin pretty routinely, and then I go on night shifts, I might need 30 units. I mean, that's a huge jump just because I don't have a regular sleep cycle. So good thing to consider if you have the opportunity with your job is trying to create a consistent bedtime and a consistent wake up time and really focus on getting more than 7.5 hours of sleep a night. Often we'll hear that 6 to 9 kind of range. And when we take a deeper dive into that data, what we see is that people who are getting less than 7.5 hours of sleep have increased rates of chronic disease, increased rates of things like dementia, osteoporosis, type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, even obesity, higher BMI. So we know that sleep is important when we kind of dive in. I always recommend if you already have a chronic condition like type 1 diabetes and you haven't given yourself the opportunity to try getting more sleep to see if you feel better, it's totally worth it. Now, we know some people need less sleep than others, and that's okay. If you find that you're not one of those people, do what works for you. But often in today's society, we get so busy, we let ourselves get so focused, on productivity that we forget to rest, and we forget to really give ourselves consistent sleep to even understand if that works for us. So I'd say shoot for 8 hours a night if you haven't tried that for at least 2 weeks in a row, and see how you feel and really listen to what your body tells you about that. So with this, insulin resistance, common feature of type 1 diabetes and PCOS when they're overlapped. Often we think of insulin resistance as something that only people with type 2 diabetes have, but that's not really true. We can get insulin resistance in type 1 diabetes if we have a set of patterns and habits that aren't working for our body. There's no blame here. It's hard to know, right? And so I don't think that if you're in a place where you have PCOS or you have a higher BMI than you'd like, or you have higher blood sugars than you like, it is not your fault. It is, though, I think, our responsibilities to figure out how to take care of ourselves in a way that feels good. So I hope that this video provided some interesting, insightful tips for you. Again, anytime you're making changes in your own diabetes, healthcare, or lifestyle regime, it's great to talk to your own doctor first. This is just providing general medical advice that we can see from the studies. So really, we're looking at this from an educational perspective. If you have any questions, I would love to hear them below. I will absolutely link these studies for those of you who are interested in looking at a little bit more of the data. And if you have any other video questions or any other female hormone questions as they relate to type 1 diabetes, I'd love to talk about this more because I really had a hard time learning about it before my medical training. Thanks for sticking it out to the end. I appreciate you, and please subscribe if you haven't. It means a whole lot to me.